before we go into our interview today, I wanted to let everyone know we have a new sponsor for our Energy Question podcast, the U.S. Oil and Gas Association, or USOGA for short. First established in 1917, USOGA has been an effective and creative voice for the industry for more than a century now. USOGA is dedicated to educating the public, policymakers, and legislators at the federal, state, and local levels about the value of the domestic oil and natural gas industry. If you're in the industry and not currently a USOGA member, please consider joining the association as a way of helping it tell your story to the policymakers whose actions impact everything you do each and every day. You can start that process by contacting USOGA through its website, usoga.org. Thanks so much to USOGA for sponsoring the Energy Question podcast. And now on with our show. Hey, welcome to the Energy Question podcast. I'm David Blackman, your host, and with me today is Jason Modglin, the president of the Texas Alliance of Energy Producers, one of my frequent guests. We had our weekly podcast during the legislative session. Now we're going to be doing this monthly as a part of our regular Energy Question lineup. And Jason, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, David, it's great to be with you, and happy summer, and looking forward to the monthly update. Now that things have slowed down a little bit. Legislative session.
Yeah, but there's still a lot to talk about, man. I was going through this list. It's not a real long list, but everything on it's pretty important. Starting with these methane regulations that will be coming soon from a federal government near you. Talk about what's going on there.
Well, quite a bit. So this month here in July, and I know this will be released here in a few weeks, but we got Subpart W updates coming out of the EPA. So you will recall very vividly, Subpart W is how operators and frankly, any producer mover of natural gas or even downstream will report their methane emissions and other types of greenhouse gas emissions to the federal government. It's a voluntary process right now, but generally most people over a certain threshold report those volumes.
Yeah.
And how it's calculated has been based on levels that were set in the 1990s, sometimes earlier than that. It's largely formulaic. Not based on actual emission volumes. And so there's been a need for a long time, recognizing that Subpart W is dated, that needs to be tweaked, needs to actually take into account actual emissions, not just some formula based on risk that was set in 1990. So that process is underway. Lots of trade associations, including ourselves and many operators, are watching that. We'll provide comments on that because that forms the basis of everything that the EPA is going to build on top of that. In October, we're going to have the final methane monitoring and reporting rules. Those are the Quad O, A, B, and on their heels, C, that deal with how methane will be monitored in the field, eventually how it will be monitored by the state regulator, and then how any violation of methane beyond a certain limit will be reported to the regulator. Yeah. Those rules come back in October. And then you'll recall very vividly, because we celebrated a 1-year anniversary of it this week, that the Inflation Reduction Act in it had a methane tax. And the methane tax says that if you are not compliant with the methane rule, of which is not final yet, and you report your volumes in Subpart W, then you are subject to a methane tax. And it's all parts of the industry, upstream, midstream, downstream, that would be subject to this tax if you are not in compliance with the monitoring rule and if you report your volumes in Subpart W. So, I said it's all built on Subpart W, and so that's kind of the deluge that's hitting everybody right now. Reading through Subpart W updates, which I think is north of 300 pages, and then we'll have the methane rule here in a month or two, and then the tax process the first of next year. So I've had lots of operators calling me. How can I read this stuff? And it's not final yet. I could give you worst case scenario, and there are lots of good environmental consultants out there that are trying to frame for people. Here's worst case scenario. Here's best case. Try to thread in between. But it's a scary process, and there's this bit of a what IPAA and your good friend Lee Fuller describe as this donut period, where the tax will be in effect, but states haven't adopted the final monitoring rules in place. And so you will be subject to the tax because you technically can't be compliant with a rule that's not final yet. And how will that work? How will you calculate your tax? So ultimately consumers are going to pay for this one way or another. And so that's concerning given our power demand needs, and the need to continue growing a natural gas fleet and natural gas for any number of things, whether it's petrochemicals or heating and electricity needs. So stay tuned on that, but it's coming very soon.
Just remember, folks, when your electricity bill starts going up because of that tax, you have Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia to thank for it, and the rest of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate. Joe Manchin was the deciding vote on that. So anyone who keeps talking about him as some sort of friend and booster for the energy business in this country needs to rethink that thought. Anyway, that's just my editorial opinion. Let's go to the lizard listing. Let's move along to the Dunes Sagebrush Lizard. And the recent announcement by U.S. Fish and Wildlife that they plan to list this very abundantly populated lizard out in the Permian Basin as an endangered species. Talk about the potential impacts that could have on the Texas oil and gas business.
You had a great podcast interview with Congressman August Pfluger.
He was terrific
on this, and so I encourage people to definitely go listen to that. He's introduced a fantastic piece of legislation to push back. But you're absolutely right. Fish and Wildlife Service, after 21 years, I believe, where this has been a process that environmentalists have pushed for the listing of the Dunes Sagebrush Lizard, a pretty ubiquitous lizard throughout West Texas, but at the same time, what lizards do best, they run and hide, and so it's hard to go out there and count them. They proposed listing as endangered due to a variety of factors. One was kind of diminishing habitat. And so there's lots of disagreement in that, particularly as it relates to oil and gas, because traditionally and throughout oil and gas 100-year history, you do have quite a bit of activity right at the start of drilling. But then largely you leave, and there's maybe a pump jack, maybe a lease road, but there's a very few surface disruptions as part of that ongoing operation.
Yeah.
Contrast that with wind or solar, where you're taking up a lot more surface acreage. You've got to regularly be out there to clean the panels, grease the turbine. It's just a very different land application. Oil and gas is different. There's temporary disruption, and then the lizards return because they don't like to be around people. So So they claim diminishing habitat. They also claim that because the nature of frac sand is to refine and break the sand down a little bit, get to more of a finer coarse, that these lizards are allergic to the finer sand. It bothers them. It makes them not want to breed and not want to do lizard things. So I thought that was pretty comical in the listing that Fish and Wildlife said that the lizards were allergic to sand. It's literally in their name. And then finally, the panacea that is all things is that the lizard will be diminished because of climate change.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with lizards, but they're cold-blooded. They like warm. They like heat. In fact, when there's more heat, there's more lizards. So
that one's hard to swallow, isn't it? Yeah.
Struggling a little bit with some of the reasoning. But I think the bottom line, what people are looking at is currently in Texas, the habitat is 6 counties that are right in the heart of the Permian Basin, captures some of the Delaware, some of the Midland Basin. This will certainly, most definitely, harm existing conservation efforts. There's been progress over the past 20 years, setting aside acreage, investing in the science of propagating this species and growing it. I think this listing will put a damper on that, but then it'll undoubtedly harm future investment in that area. Yeah. And the area is of question because the listing allows for the secretary to draw a bigger map.
Of course.
And so where would the lizard potentially like to go? Well, David, you and I don't know that, but lizards like to migrate, and the secretary is certainly in tune with that. And so she will draw a map that I would suspect is bigger than 6 counties.
I suspect it will be. Yes, I think we can count on that.
And so, that's a little bit concerning because in the listing, the only problem industry was oil and gas. There was no mention of alternate energy sources, no mention of roads, no mention of houses. It's just oil and gas is the problem. And so that's pretty concerning. For folks out there, and it should be concerning for folks across the country. I mean, the Permian Basin is the source of our energy security right now. Well over 40% of our oil, over a quarter of our natural gas, when you take into account New Mexico as well. And the idea that we would potentially put a cap on any growth out of that area is just very disturbing. And so appreciate Congress, Congressman Pfluger with the Lizard Act. I'm forgetting the acronym, but it's got zealots in there. So that's all.
Yeah. I wish I had written it down so I could recite it. But it's an acronym.
And then other efforts, the Supreme Court in the 1970s said there's no economic test on endangered species. And certainly when we think about bald eagles or whales, we'd say absolutely there should be no economic test on those. But that's not where courts have gone lately.
Right.
They've said that as long as you're mitigating climate change, you can put a price on an eagle or put a price on a whale. And so that's a little bit of that's a very different standard, particularly if you're going to target the oil and gas industry and say that they are the cause of climate disruption, but then allow for anyone else in that area to just put a bounty. If you kill an eagle, well, it's going to cost you $50,000.
Right. But only if you're in the oil and gas business. Wind farms can kill all the eagles they want.
That's right. That's right.
Have a take permit for
you. Want to kill a whale?
You've kill the whales on the East Coast? Sure. No problem. It's wind. But if an oil and gas operator had a platform out there in the Atlantic Ocean, and a well washed up on shore adjacent to that, all hell would break loose. And,
I'm struggling with the logic.
It's crazy.
If they're trying to protect the species, they've got to protect the species, not pick and choose who could potentially disrupt. So right. There will undoubtedly be court cases on this. I think we've mentioned, but just the Permian Basin Petroleum Association has been a phenomenal leader on this for a long time, Ben Shepherd. And so to the extent that we start to see either private or state litigation, I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah. And that's not the only effort by the Biden administration to diminish activity in the Permian Basin. We also have this ongoing and apparently renewed threat from the EPA to hold this sparsely populated region of Texas and New Mexico somehow in non-attainment of ozone standards. Congressman Pfluger mentioned he was hearing more and more talk about that moving forward as well. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so just this week, and we're recording at kind of the end of July, sue and settle is back. I thought we got rid of that. We certainly did with the Trump administration, but sue and settle is back. So a group in California led by the Sierra Club and the Environmental Defense Fund sued the EPA to say, hey, guys, you really haven't looked at ozone standards in quite a while for power plants. And you really need to go back and look and see if those limits need to be revised. And EPA, I'm sure, had about a 5-minute conversation on it and decided they got us. We got to settle, guys. And so they went to the court, federal court in California, and said they got us, and we agreed to a settlement. And so EPA is going to roll out new NOx standards for power plants, specifically natural gas power plants. They're going to be rolling those out over 2024. And so they've been in this process now of revisiting both ozone and NOx standards. And as they continue to ratchet those down, you continue to grab rural parts of America that are just caught up in these types of standards. The other one that frequently catches agricultural communities is particulate matter. Yeah. Getting back to the lizards are allergic to dust and sand. Well, you drive down a country road, and if it hasn't been hosed or sprayed or treated in any way, you're going to have a dust cloud behind you.
Yeah, we're going to have to outlaw caliche pretty soon, I guess.
And so as that particulate matter standard gets lower, or as NOx standard or ozone standard, you just start to grab parts of rural America that have nothing to do with industrial activity, but just because of the background level of activity would qualify as non-attainment. And so there was a brief reprieve, if you will, last year when EPA staff kind of threw this into an agenda, and then it went away. But if they lower the standard, every area, not just the Permian Basin, will have to be revisited to see if it meets attainment or non-attainment.
Yeah. Well, okay. So enough about the feds. That's plenty. Let's come back to Texas and talk about the legislature, which after it only took 2 special sessions, one full one and part of another, for the House and Senate to finally agree on a property tax cut, which we talked about every episode that we did during our weekly podcast during the session. So where did we end up finally on the property tax?
We ended up with not quite the level of compression that I think everyone was wanting, but homeowners and particularly those with a homestead on their property saw a pretty substantial increase in that homestead exemption on their school property taxes. So instead of the 18 cents that I and others were advocating for, it's going to be a school tax reduction of approximately 10 cents, maybe 11 cents for some districts. That homestead exemption on your school property taxes goes from 40,000 up to 100,000. That's the minimum. There are some districts in the state that have higher homestead exemptions, and so you might not see it in some districts if they've already raised that homestead exemption. But it's something to keep in mind. The House did get kind of an interesting item in there that they wanted to have appraisal caps in the discussion. And what they ultimately were able to do is get a temporary 20% cap on properties under $5 million. So these could be small business property. This could be investment homes or second homes that aren't covered by homestead exemptions, but something under $5 million could potentially have a 20% appraisal cap moving forward for the next 5 years. That's intriguing for a lot of people, particularly small businesses. What they did do, though, is specific to small business, take about a $1.2 million cap that was existing with the state business tax, and they doubled that. So they took that up to nearly 2.5 million in annual revenue. If you're under that threshold, you'll be exempt from the state franchise tax. So it's a little bit of everything. I think what's entirely clear is that the Lieutenant Governor stood firm and got a lot of what he and the senators were pushing for. Senator Betancourt out of Houston has put out a lot of press since then that the average home in Texas will save approximately $1,300 on their property tax bill. That's a bold statement.
That is a bold statement. That's $100 a month.
There's no question there will be a reduction in property tax obligations, but it's always tough to commit to a number because people are going to throw it right back in your face. But
that's right. Yeah, that's a risk.
But the key part of this, they took $18 billion out of that budget surplus, which was provided by oil and gas and business in this state, surplus tax collections, and are returning approximately $18 billion back to taxpayers in the form of property tax cuts. So it's not what we wanted entirely, but it's a good thing. It's not necessarily new spending. It's a return to the economy. Government shouldn't have more money than they need to run their operations, and so returning a portion of that back to the economy, back to homeowners, is a good thing.
Yeah. And that's something that wouldn't have happened, in many other states, most other states, certainly not in California or New York or any state in the Northeast. And so, it's just when you have an enormous surplus like that, to have a legislature that focuses on giving the majority of it back to the taxpayers is a rare thing in the modern world. And it's just part of being in Texas. And I think it's something we should all be thankful for. The grid. The other big issue here in Texas, of course, in a hot summer, which is not nearly as hot as 1980, by the way, so don't believe the propaganda in the media about that, but it is a hot summer. There's been some days when ERCOT was not quite sure it was going to have enough resources to get us through, but they've managed through it. And, that's a pretty good performance, I think, so far by the grid. What do you think?
I agree with you. They have managed through it. We continue to have added demands, and really, as we've talked about quite a bit over the last few years, really the only new additions to the grid have been solar and battery, and then the third category would be wind. There have been some additions of natural gas, but by and large, coal has largely started to be phased out and closed. We haven't had reinvestment in nuclear to kind of shore up some of that baseload power. And so we rely heavily on the sun shining and the wind blowing. And when those don't perform, our backstop is natural gas. And so ERCOT has managed through that process. Hopefully that continues. We got kind of one more month of summer, and that August, September is always a hot time here in Texas. So and then that leads right into hurricane season, and so that always is a disruption, particularly for the poles and wires companies that have to get back out there and make sure that the wires are back up so that they can move power around. So they've done a great job, and we'll see kind of as we continue to perform what level of investment the PUC can attract into this market, so that we can have some more natural gas resources. If coal or nuclear can join the party, that would be fantastic. Keeping in mind that we're still going to add wind and solar, but that doesn't offset the need for natural gas. Right. When those go to zero, you have to have a backstop. And so it's counterintuitive. People are always pointing to look at all the money that wind and solar is saving us. And for the end consumer, that is true. But bearing in mind, you're building two simultaneous systems. Right. You're building both wind and solar and a backstop at the same time to make sure that when those go to zero, a battery can kick on for 15 minutes or natural gas can kick on and run for several hours until demand decreases. So they're managing to get by right now. That's for sure.
Yeah. And so, yes. And so every time somebody tells me how cheap wind and solar are, I ask them and anybody else who wants to chime in, has anyone's utility rates gone down since we started piling all this wind and solar into our grid? No. Yeah. Your rates have gone up dramatically. The more renewables we put on this system, the higher the rates go. So I guess measured one way and in an isolation, right, without considering in context the overall impact to the grid, yeah, they're technically cheap. But when you consider the overall impact to the grid reliability and sustainability, they're not cheap at all, man. This is really costing us a lot, and it all gets passed on to the consumers. And, but thankfully, and we should give kudos to the folks at ERCOT for managing through this summer, and to the folks at the PUC and in the legislature for enacting the reforms to the system that needed to be made, and to Governor Abbott for approving them and pushing them, Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker, everybody involved. 2 years ago, if you'd asked me if we're going to get through a summer like this, I'd have laughed. And it looks like we may get through without any significant blackouts. And so, they all deserve our gratitude and congratulations for that, I think.
That's right. That's right.
And with that little bit of pontification, we will shut this sucker down for this month, Jason.
Perfect. Looking forward to the next one. And thank you very much for having me.
Hey, man. Thank you. Always appreciate it. Always great talking with you. Thanks also to our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel, to the Sandstone Group for hosting our podcast, and to the good folks at the U.S. Oil and Gas Association for being our sponsor. I'm David Blackman, and that is all for now.